Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Map Room. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us this week we have Jared Stone and Nick Morris. We've been going over some interesting states the last few weeks, and I think this one is no exception. We're going over the swing state of Pennsylvania, which was a long part of the Democratic blue wall that controlled the presidential outcome and was really a stable state for Democrats for decades in that regard. But it flipped famously to Donald Trump in 2016. It also has a very unusual down ballot tendency where there used to be a lot of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and we're seeing a realignment in that area even in the last decade or so. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into things and get started. One of the things that's really kind of helpful to show what we're talking about here with Pennsylvania is going over elections. So I'm going to start with the presidential election and then show you a little bit of the gubernatorial and Senate races just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So for a while, Pennsylvania voted pretty closely to the national average. It voted very similarly in 1972, a little bit below Richard Nixon's performance nationwide. It voted a little bit better for Jimmy Carter in 76. And in 1980, it was no different. Ronald Reagan won it, but he did slightly worse there than he did nationally. 1984 kind of signaled a little bit of a change, though. Obviously, Ronald Reagan won the 1984 election by a gigantic margin. One of the largest popular vote victories ever. But he only won the state by 8 percentage points, which is really kind of an underperformance. Republicans were able to hold on to it in 1988, but still it was again below it. It was a 52 to 45 win or something along that lines at the national level. But in Pennsylvania, it was much closer. It was only 2 percentage points. This is part of a trend you were seeing in the Rust Belt, where a lot of those states started to trend back to Democrats a little bit sooner. 1992. Bill Clinton did really well there. He well outperformed his national margins, and he did the same thing in 1996. It was a little bit better than he did nationally, a little close to it, but still. 2000 was, again, another election where Democrats did really strongly in Pennsylvania. This is obviously a really close election, but Al Gore was able to outperform his national margin here. George Bush put efforts into targeting Pennsylvania, and he did put targets all over Appalachia, into places like West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. But it didn't really pay off here. Even though Republicans were able to win the Senate race, they lost this race. We saw this phenomenon again in 2004. Bush had aggressively targeted Pennsylvania. He had supported some tariffs, which were counterintuitive to his general policy. And even though he won the vote nationally, he still lost Pennsylvania by around 2.5 percentage points, even as a Republican senator was being reelected. 2008 was like Michigan, where the rails started to go off. This is a 10-point win for Barack Obama. Again, a little bit larger, 2 points or so better than his national margin. Obviously, Republicans targeted the state, but you could see still a lot of down-ballot trends. Specifically, a lot of these counties in the southwestern portion of the state that had long supported Democrats flipped to John McCain. And then a lot of these counties over in the eastern portion of the state around Philadelphia started to perform more strongly for Democrats. 2012 was another year where Republicans tried to take on Pennsylvania, and they did better. This was pretty close to the national vote this time, still a small overperformance for Obama, but Republicans did respectively. They won back places like Chester County and Berks County that they had lost in the previous election, while also strengthening their gains in the southwestern portion of the state. 2016 was infamous in that Donald Trump managed to flip the state. He did much better here than he did nationally. He was losing the popular vote nationally, but he won it in Pennsylvania by a good margin. Republicans also won the Senate races we'll get into shortly. But you'll notice the big trend here is just how rapidly those rural areas in Pennsylvania really shifted. It's not even a comparison. You go back and forth here. You can see how wild those shifts were. And he even did better in some areas in the Lehigh Valley, and specifically in the Scranton metropolitan area, which had traditionally leaned more Democratic, but he managed to flip counties like Luzerne and came very close to winning Lackawanna County, which is home of Scranton itself. He also, there were a couple counties there was one county that flipped to the Democrats, though, which is Chester County, which is part of that suburban realignment. So what are we talking about with the suburban realignment? I'm going to show you a map that I made here of the presidential and Senate race, and the presidential comparison for 2016 before I show you the 2016 Senate race. So both Republican candidates won this race. Pat Toomey won his race by around a larger margin than Donald Trump, actually. He won nearly 100,000 vote difference in his race, whereas Donald Trump won it by closer to 40 or 35,000. You'll notice here with this map that Donald Trump outperformed Toomey in large portions of the state, specifically the southwestern portion, the Scranton area, and a lot of these rural areas, even in some areas of the Harrisburg area. But where Toomey did better was in a lot of the urban areas. He did better in Allegheny County, which is home of Pittsburgh. He did better in Erie County, which is home of Erie. He did better in Centre County, which is the home of the Penn State. And he did much, much better in these traditionally suburban Republican counties in around Philadelphia. He also did better in the Lehigh Valley, which is where he used to represent when he was a congressman. He had previously challenged Arlen Specter in 2004 and narrowly lost. And when he did that, he was the representative of this region. So that's the presidential history, and kind of gives you an idea of the trends that we're talking about. But to really understand those trends, you need to look at some of the state level results. So I'm going to show you some highlights that really kind of show you what the traditional alignment in Pennsylvania has been, and as we'll explain later, what the future alignment of Pennsylvania looks like. So 1986 is actually a good place to start for the gubernatorial races. This is kind of the more traditional split of Pennsylvania, where eastern or western Pennsylvania, specifically around Pittsburgh, a lot of coal mining communities, steel areas, working class, were strongly Democratic, voted for Bob Casey, who was a pro-life Democrat, staunchly pro-life. If you're familiar with the Supreme Court decision Planned Parenthood versus Casey in the 1990s, he's the Casey in that case. He was the pro-life governor in that case. Bill Scranton, a prominent family in Pennsylvania around the Scranton metropolitan area, and there is a coincidence in the name. They're the ones who founded the town. He lost that area, but he did really well in the Pittsburgh or Philadelphia metropolitan area and in some of the Lehigh Valley. And so you'll notice he lost this race narrowly to Bob Casey by around 2%. 1990 is one of the starkest maps you'll ever see. Republicans only won one county, Montgomery County, which, if you know anything about Pennsylvania politics today, would never happen. It's a safely Democratic county now, but back then was a Republican-leaning suburban county. Bob Casey won every county in the state except for Montgomery. But you'll notice he did fairly poorly in the Philadelphia metropolitan area, specifically in Chester, Delaware, and Bucks, which are more traditionally Republican areas. 94 represented a new type of candidate, a pro-choice Republican in Tom Ridge. You'll notice that the Democratic candidate here, Mark Singal, lost this race, and Tom Ridge was able to win with large margins throughout the state. Because he was a pro-choice candidate, a pro-choice Republican, you had a third-party candidate, Peg Luskick, you had a third-party candidate who ran on the Constitution line as a pro-life candidate, who won about 12% of the vote, 13% of the vote. Really strong performance for a third party. You see this again in 98, where Tom Ridge won every county in the state this time, except for Philadelphia County, home of Philadelphia. It's a consolidated city county. But again, that pro-life contingent came out and gave a third-party candidate around 10% of the vote. So the current alignment, that's kind of what it used to look like. And in the Senate races, you see something similar. This is a map from 1980, which is actually shocking today. You'll notice again the western portion of the state staunchly Democratic, whereas Arlen Specter, a moderate Republican who was pro-choice among other things, actually won Philadelphia itself, which would be impossible today. Finally, we have 1994, which kind of shows an unusual race. Rick Santorum, commonly associated as a social conservative, actually did very well in the Philadelphia area for most of his career on the strength of those Republicans. He won in the 94 Red Wave. He won all of those counties around Philadelphia. He did pretty well elsewhere. And then in 2000, even though George Bush was losing the state, he won Pennsylvania pretty resoundingly over Democrat Ron Klink. You'll notice again, Philadelphia area, very strong performance. So what happened to these candidates? Well, the Senate races actually kind of give you a good indication of what can go on. And the current Senate race probably shows you the maximum Republican suburban performance at this point. Pat Toomey obviously won that race, as we said before. But if you look at this map real quick, you'll notice it was based kind of on an unsustainable coalition long term. He won Chester County, he won Bucks County, he won Centre County, and he did relatively poorly in some of the rural areas. This is the more traditional of the Republican paths to victory in Pennsylvania. The Trump path presents another option, which is a blue-collar path based predominantly in the rural areas of the state. And so as we'll explain later, obviously, There's a large number of reasons these shifts have occurred, but one of them is just because of natural changes. Specifically in southwestern Pennsylvania, a lot of those voters are union Democrats. They've traditionally voted for union candidates, steel workers or miners, even though Pittsburgh itself is more of a cosmopolitan area now with a large number of pharmaceutical companies and, among other things, involved in tech. That area is still traditionally associated with that. And you can kind of see the trends there, specifically in this map of the Pennsylvania 17 race, which is represented by a moderate Democrat, Connor Lamb, who was able to really dominate in a lot of the suburban areas in Allegheny County that used to vote for Republicans. Even though Republicans have performed fairly strongly in Pennsylvania as of late, underneath the surface in places like Allegheny County, you're noticing a lot of these suburban areas have a realignment. So one other area that's really important to talk about Pennsylvania before we get into some of the more granular details is the House races, which are have kind of been a fiasco. If you paid attention to our North Carolina discussion a couple weeks ago, you notice we talked about how the lines had been redrawn mid-decade, and we saw this same trend in Pennsylvania. At the start of the decade, Republicans had control of the legislature and the governor's office, and so they were able to draw the maps that they saw fit in the congressional level. The maps did have Democratic support, in part because it protected some Democratic incumbents at the House level. So it wasn't purely a partisan vote, but it was definitely a partisan gerrymander. And this was the result. This map, which lasted until 2018 when new maps were created, resulted in 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats for all of the decade, in fact. So you'll notice here some of the divides we're talking about. 12 here get some of the northern areas of Allegheny County, and 18 draws in some of the southern ones, along with a couple of more rural counties that have a strong down-ballot tendency. Erie County, if you'll notice here, was split in two, because at the time it was a Democratic-leaning county. District number 17 right here was a very Democratic district. It drew in not only Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, but also some of the Lehigh Valley areas that have been trending more Democratic. Now, finally, the lines around Philadelphia are the most absurd, and that was mainly to protect Republican candidates. Places like the district like number 8, 7, 6, 16, these were all drawn to protect Republican incumbents there. And this map probably would have failed anyway, even if it hadn't been redrawn, because many of these incumbents started facing difficulties for various reasons following the 2016 election. But it obviously didn't help that they lost this map. So what was the map that it was changed to? So this is the map that they adopted for the 2018 elections. This was decided by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which was controlled by the Democratic Party and still is. So some have tried to call it a Democratic gerrymander. There's some lines here Republicans would disagree with, but on the whole, it produced a 9-9 map. So it's really hard to label it as an aggressive gerrymander. Obviously, the lines here are a lot cleaner, and there are some big changes that occurred. Specifically, the 17th district here, a lot of renumbering occurred. But Pennsylvania now has a competitive district in the Pittsburgh area, the 17th, which is a marginally Republican seat represented by Connor Lamb, a moderate Democrat, as we explained earlier. Most of these interior districts, like 16, 15, 14, all the way to 12, are very, very Republican, including district number 9 right here. District number 11, as well, is also staunchly Republican, but there's a lot of new swing districts and safe Democratic seats. The 10th district right here is actually more of a toss-up seat at the moment. It's a Republican-leaning district, but it was definitely drawn to be more favorable to Democrats, especially in the Harrisburg area, the state capital. The 8th district here is, on paper, is a Republican district, but it's represented by a strong Democrat at the moment, who doesn't seem to be at a huge risk of losing, but obviously, given the district was won by President Trump by a decent margin, is at the top of the list. The 7th district here is the Lehigh Valley area. It leans Democratic now, has a Democratic representative, as does district number 6. Also, the 5th district right here was changed to be more Democratic, and the 1st district as well was a district that voted for Hillary Clinton, but has a Republican representative, Brian Fitzpatrick, who is very moderate and very popular. So that's what the map looks like at the moment, and I'm going to show you the Elections Daily ratings we have for this cycle. There are a handful of competitive congressional races in Pennsylvania, unlike in a lot of other states. So you'll notice here that Republicans have 8. They have 7 safe districts here, all rooted around the center of the state and some of those rural areas that have been really trending. The 17th district might vote for Donald Trump this time, but Connor Lamb seems to be fairly safe. Similarly, in the 8th district, this is a district that may well vote for Donald Trump again this time, being based in the Scranton area, but it's represented by popular Democrat Matt Cartwright. We have it leans Democratic because it's a little bit redder than those other ones. The 7th is also theoretically competitive. It's represented by Democrat Susan Wild, but Republicans have a very, very credible nominee in that race that could make it a little bit closer than usual. Finally, in the 1st district, which kind of teeters on leans or likely, it's almost certainly going to vote for Joe Biden in this cycle. But Brian Fitzpatrick is a machine. He has a strong family name there. He has an extremely moderate record, specifically on labor issues. He's been endorsed by unions in the past and probably will be again this time. It's very hard to attack him on his record, and Democrats have just had a very difficult time unseating him in what should be a favorable district. Finally, the 10th is kind of the marquee race of Pennsylvania. This is a district that probably will vote for President Trump in his reelection campaign, but they have a very strong Democratic nominee, Eugene DePascal, who is the Auditor General of the state of Pennsylvania, a very popular figure, a moderate-leaning Democrat, going up against Scott Perry, who is a member of the Freedom Caucus, kind of an ideological misfit in his district. So that's kind of the baseline of the House races. And to really understand why we have these ratings, even though there are a lot of competing trends, you need to kind of understand the basics of what we're talking about with the realignment here. So I'm going to throw it to Nick, who's going to kind of go into detail about some of these trends we're talking about.
Okay, so to understand the demographic and political breakdown of the state, you really have to look at the region by region breakdown. And if you really look into it, you can see that some of the features, some of the demographic and political features are very different across the state. So the first area I want to cover is southeastern Pennsylvania, which is definitely the most urban, suburban area of the state because it includes Philadelphia, one of the biggest cities in the country. I believe it's the 5th biggest or something along those lines, but very urban. And this is one of the areas that Hillary Clinton did very well in. And despite having lost the state having flipped from 2012 to 2016, she actually did very well in these areas. She swung a lot of those counties, like Delaware County and Chester County, which have been important in House races in recent history. But the rest of the state tells a different story. So moving up, you've got the Lehigh Valley and Berks County, which has been more of a Republican swing in that time. And then you got northeastern Pennsylvania, which has actually seen much bigger swings. You got Scranton area, which is sort of in the middle of that region, which is typically a Democratic stronghold. It's sort of anchored around that whole Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area. But over the recent years, you got quite big swings. In fact, Pennsylvania's 8th district, which Eric discussed in his House section, is kind of the quintessential Obama-Trump district, if you think about it. Obama won it by about 10 points, and then Trump won it by about 8. So it's a big wild card, like especially for 2020. Eric said that Trump might win this, but there's really no way of knowing for sure, especially since Joe Biden has got this whole Scranton Joe reputation. Now moving down to South Central, you got cities such as Lancaster, York, and Harrisburg. This is sort of a mix of Republicans and Democrats across the region. You got Democrats in those cities, but typically it's a very Republican region. But you got some interesting dynamics there. You got the interesting House races Eric mentioned. You got some interesting state legislative races, as Jared might talk about later. And then moving on to the western part of the state as it is, you got the central Pennsylvania and the north central Pennsylvania areas. They're typically quite rural. Few people actually live in this area. Probably the biggest urban area in these regions is probably in Center County, which includes College Station. It's I believe the home of Penn State University. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but typically a lot more democratic than the rest of the regions. And then looking into northwestern and southwestern Pennsylvania, this is where you get the interesting dynamics. Now, if you've listened to this podcast before, you might know that I am not really a fan of using the terms trending Democratic and trending Republican. I think they're very overused, but in this case, I think it can be very accurate. For instance, if you look at Cambria County, this used to very much be a swing county. Obama won it, Bush won it in 2000, but in recent years, it's swung very much to Republicans, and Trump has won it by almost 40 points. So that is around the west of the central Pennsylvania region, but it is very similar to the southwestern region. A similar county is also Greene County, very, very similar dynamics there. That's in the very southwest corner of the state. Now, these are two counties, Cambria and Greene, which have faced quite enormous population decline. These aren't the only counties in the state that have done this, but if you look at the trends that have gone on here in the last couple of decades, you'll very much see why I consider these areas to be trending Republican. And that's not a phrase I use very often. Now, the southwestern Pennsylvania area also does include Pittsburgh, which is a very big city by Pennsylvania standards. It's the second biggest city in the state, and it's got a lot of Democratic voters, as you might expect. But the area around it is very industrial. You've got a lot of steel workers, I believe, and this is typically an area where you might find a lot of Trump voters. Not in Pittsburgh itself. Pittsburgh is actually a city that swung to Hillary Clinton from Mitt Romney, but the area around it does typically have those industrial voters, which flipped from Obama to Trump between 2012 and 2016, and you sort of see a similar dynamic in northwestern Pennsylvania. This is where you can find Erie. That's in the northwest corner of the state. That is another Obama-Trump county. Trump won it by a very narrow margin. Also, another map that I want to bring up is this one. This is while we're on the topic of southwestern Pennsylvania, and this is a map of the old Pennsylvania's 12th district. This is one that was around between 2003 and 2013. As you can see, it has a very odd shape. This is because it was drawn as essentially as an ancestral Democratic vote sink. It takes in Greene County in the southwestern part of the state, and it also takes in Cambria County. And as you can see, those two counties voted very heavily for Democrats. This was a district that stayed blue for most of the decade, but now it would be very red. It would have voted for Trump by a large margin. In fact, this is the only district in the country that voted for John Kerry in 2004 and John McCain in 2008. So it has very much defied the trends of the rest of the country. And this is largely because of that population loss, which I mentioned earlier. And also in more recent times, you can see that dynamic of voters flipping from Democratic to Republican. This is particularly a Trump era dynamic, but yeah, it very much does fit in with the trends of the rest of the state.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, of course, that Pittsburgh itself is not only an urban area, it's a growing and diverse area, and the suburbs around it often don't have that industrial character, but certainly the rest of the areas in that region, specifically in the Southwest and the more Appalachian portions of the state, tend to be a lot more certainly along that line of a more industrial or mining communities, all that sort of stuff. Before we go over to Jared, I wanted to show one more thing, which is a map of the combined statistical areas of Pennsylvania. Obviously, Pennsylvania has a lot of metropolitan areas, a lot of micropolitan areas, but this is the multi-county areas. And you'll notice a lot of the state is part of these. Places like, obviously the largest ones, though, if you look at these by population, are definitely Philadelphia has the largest one, 4.5 million. Then the Pittsburgh area has around 2.5 million, followed by Harrisburg at 1.2 million. And then it really starts to get off into places like Scranton and Erie, which have far less population. The one thing I wanted to show, though, is how these vote trends are pretty clear here. So Philadelphia is the most Democratic region, if you look at it. It voted for Barack Obama with around 65% of the vote. And it was a very similar performance in 2016 for Democrats, depending on whether or not you include Bucks County, or whether or not you include Berks County or not. But Pittsburgh's another story. Barack Obama only narrowly won the Pittsburgh area, the combined statistical area. So he won it by around 27,000 votes. Whereas if you combine the 2012 and 2016 results, Republicans actually win it with around 52% of the vote. So people often say of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are the Democratic strongholds of the state, and they are. But the two metropolitan areas aren't really the same. Even Allegheny itself is a county that Republicans have won in the past, specifically Governor Tom Corbett in 2010. So now we're going to go over into Jared, who's going to go really granular into some of these details here.
Yeah, so the first thing I'm going to show you are some miscellaneous maps that demonstrate some of the voting patterns of various congressional districts. And then we'll go over to some data districting maps that I make to showcase some trends. And then finally, a few other things that demonstrate some of the more regional trends that we've seen very recently in terms of Republicans losing a lot of vote share, especially in those collar counties of Philadelphia. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few maps of various districts and some of their voting patterns. The first one is going to be of the 2018 Congress. Now, there are actually two races that Connor Lamb had in 2018. The first one was a special election earlier in the year, and then he had the regular general election in 2018 in November. And there's some interesting things, not only in the maps themselves, but in just basically the circumstances. When Connor Lamb was running early in the special election in 2018, the district did not look like this at all. As Eric mentioned, there was a districting change around that time. The lines that were run in November were not the same as previous. And so when Connor Lamb ran in the special election earlier that year against Rick Saccone, who happened to be a pretty underwhelming and disappointing Republican choice, he actually had lines that basically stretched to some of the lower Southwest Pennsylvania counties, such as Westmoreland and Greene County and Washington County, and then encapsulated some of these more southern areas of Allegheny County and Pittsburgh. And he managed to win that race very narrowly by less than 1%, mainly on the back of his performance in Allegheny County, which is, again, the site of Pittsburgh. And so when he decided to run again in November under these new lines, which are more oriented towards northern Allegheny County, as well as some of its western areas, as well as Beaver County, he actually had to do sort of a double take and realize that he had to triangulate different groups. And so his coalition that brought him through in the special election, which was much more oriented around that white working class that is typical in Southwest Pennsylvania, had to be changed to a more college-educated and progressive crowd that we see in some of these areas, especially in southeastern Beaver County and then Allegheny County in general. And so in the 2018 Congress, the regular election, as you can see, Connor Lamb won by around 12 to 13%. So very sizable victory. He's in very little danger of losing this time around. Going to the first district, which is again represented by Brian Fitzpatrick, who is related to Mike Fitzpatrick, who had some serious health concerns, and the baton was basically given to Brian, his brother. You can see here that Bucks County is the anchor of this district. However, there is a little bit of an extension into Montgomery County. And that is essentially one of the reasons why this district, even though it does elect the moderate Republican to Congress, is a little more Dem-leaning in its presidential choices. It voted for the Democrat for the president in 2012 and 2016, as you can see on the left. Montgomery County, or at least the portion of it that's included in Pennsylvania's first district, is very heavily Democratic, and so it tends to sway the district. However, Brian Fitzpatrick, hasn't had too much to worry about, especially in the 2018 election where he won by between 2 and 3%, mainly on the back of his strong name recognition and performance, as well as his record as a moderate Republican, which really allowed some of those Trump skeptic voters to come back into his camp and to vote for him once again. Going over to the 8th district, represented by Matt Cartwright, as Eric mentioned earlier, takes in Lackawanna County, which is home to Scranton, as well as part of Luzerne, which is home to Wilkes-Barre. These are ancestrally some more Democratic areas. However, Trump really made gains in these types of places that have a lot of industrial ancestry and tradition. And so Wayne County, Pike County, Monroe County also helped deliver a huge victory to Trump in 2016. He won the district by around 10%. But Matt Cartwright has been able to buck some of those trends. His incumbency advantage is really recognizable and strong here. And so he was able to win quite handily in 2018, as he should in 2020. However, it might be a little bit closer just because of presidential results. And then going over to the 10th district, represented by Scott Perry, who is more of a fiscal and a social conservative, which makes him a little bit idiosyncratic for this district because it is one that's a little more competitive. Trump won this district by around 9%, so a very decent margin for him. And then Pat Toomey won this district by a larger 12%, mainly because in Dauphin County, which is home to Harrisburg, he was able to win that county quite narrowly. However, Eugene D. Pasquale, who is the state auditor currently, was able to win this district as well in 2016. He's from the area, and so he has a serious home field advantage here. And that's one of the many reasons why this district is going to be a barn burner district for 2020, and definitely one to look at. Finally, before I move on to my DRA, to give you a demonstration of the trends that we've seen in the collar counties recently, you can really see through here some of the difficulties that Donald Trump had in getting those ancestral and moderate Republicans together in the collar counties. Chester County, which went for Mitt Romney 4 years beforehand, went for Hillary Clinton this time by around 10%. And Bucks County, had some opposite trends at play, in that the northern section of the county, being a more white working class area in nature, did swing towards Trump. However, there were some areas, especially around Ben Salem and Levittown, that did swing more towards Hillary Clinton, allowing a sort of balance to be achieved. But Pat Toomey did significantly better here for obvious reasons. His strength among suburbanites was remarkable. He was able to win back the counties like Bucks and Chester. Okay, so those are some things I wanted to show you. Now I have two maps from Days Redistricting that I drew that just sort of show some of the regional trends at play. The first one, I intended this to be a relatively fair map, in that it emphasizes some pretty distinct regional differences, and it also allows for a pretty even partisan split as far as representation. A few things that you can see here. First of all, going to the Pittsburgh area in Allegheny County, there's a district that is entirely confined within Allegheny County. And so Mike Doyle, who's the current representative of the urban Pittsburgh area, would probably have a district like this. It is a safely Democratic district, takes in some of the strongly urban areas of Pittsburgh as well as the immediate suburbs, some of which are actually Democratic trending, interestingly enough. And then you have this district that takes in more of the western part, as well as Beaver County. That's basically the stronghold of this district. It's basically its anchor. And so a Connor Lamb type candidate would do quite well here. It's a district that has some more Republican strength than the other Allegheny County district, but Connor Lamb, being a moderate Democrat who was able to, again, triangulate those different forces that allowed him to get a victory, he would do quite well in a district like this. And so you have two potentially Democratic districts in Western Pennsylvania. Those are completely surrounded by expectedly heavily Republican districts. Showing you some of the county labels, you can see here that Washington, Greene, Westmoreland, Fayette County, these are counties that were heavily Democratic, ancestrally speaking. They even did well for Kerry back in 2004 before starting to shift more towards Republicans with McCain in 2008. These represent a strongly Republican district. And then even Erie County in the Northwest, which is historically Democratic, it went narrowly towards Trump, and it, in sync with some of these other counties, would render this district that you can see right here as a safely Republican district. When you get into the central portion of Pennsylvania, which is much more rural and much less diverse than some of the more metropolitan areas, these are admittedly heavily Republican districts. And so even though Center County is home to Penn State University, which is a Democratic area, it's completely surrounded by heavily Republican counties. And so whatever district Center County is going to be in, it's just the Democratic strength there is going to be counterbalanced by the inevitable Republican strength surrounding it. Then going to the Northeast, I tried to make a scenario where some of the traditional Democratic strongholds are able to be connected to really preserve that integrity of Democratic strength that has been inherent and traditional in this area. And I did that by combining Lackawanna County with Scranton, with some areas like Monroe and Carbon County, and then going down into the Lehigh Valley area, which is also a place of historical Democratic strength. In cities like Bethlehem and Allentown, this district would be a Democratic district, pretty safely so. However, some of this other territory that has been put aside in Northeast Pennsylvania would have a more Republican bent, especially with Trump's gains there in 2016. Some of this other central area, including the Harrisburg-based district, you can see right here with Dauphin County and some of the surrounding ones. There's some Amish influence here, and also some historical and ancestral Republican influence in places like York and Lancaster would render these places strongly Republican. And so once you get down to the Philadelphia area, that's where you start to see some changes. Now, one of the interesting things that you would note about the Philadelphia area is that even Mitt Romney was able to showcase some of the areas of traditional Republican strength. These include, again, Lancaster County, as well as some of the surrounding suburban, exurban areas of Chester County, not the interior, but more of the exterior of it, going into western Delaware County. Even though Delaware County is strongly Democratic right now, there's still some pockets of Republican strength that can be noticed. And I'll show you that a little bit later with some of the state legislative things. Finally, you have Montgomery County, which has become a very safely Democratic county, even though it did vote against Bob Casey Sr. in 1990, as has Chester County, Eastern Delaware County, and then the Philadelphia area. But as you can see, this Bucks-based district that has a little vestige sticking into the Philadelphia County, which is a consolidated city county, there's still some remnants of Republican support in the northeastern portion of Philadelphia. So even though the city is strongly Democratic, there are still some more blue-collar areas in the surrounding regions of Philadelphia that lean more Republican. So that's that with a fair map. To get a more gerrymandered map that would be more favorable to the GOP, you'd have to do a couple of things. The first thing I'd recommend is essentially shoring up urban Pittsburgh into a single district that would allow the surrounding district, even though some of the surrounding immediate areas in Allegheny County could potentially be a little more Democratic leaning, it would be more than compensated by the Republican influence of places like Beaver County and just some of the surrounding areas. And this leaves more opportunity for Republican districts in Western Pennsylvania. You can also see that Erie, the city of Erie, and Erie County as a whole are split up, just because that is another vestige of Democratic strength here that you'd want to split up for a Republican gerrymander. And then you also see some splits going on over here. You can see Luzerne County is split up to help Republicans, and the 8th County has some serious Republican strength now, just because of Trump's overperformance there. And then finally going down into the Philadelphia metropolitan region, you can see that there's not really much room for Republicans to grow here. In fact, they have been on a rapid decline in the past few years. And so any effort to shore up Democratic support in whatever there is here is probably the best way to go for Republicans. Even as the first district, represented by Brian Fitzpatrick, should remain in his hands, and thus should take in some more Republican areas, ideally, just to help him stay afloat. So that's just a theoretical situation that I made just to help out Republicans if they want to do such a gerrymander. The next thing I want to go into, and sort of the final general topic, is some of the more granular stuff that has to do with the state legislature. This website is C-Analysis. We used this for a previous episode. I highly recommend it. It's very intuitive and very interactive, and just has great graphics and great information going on. Here is a map that was created by C-Analysis to demonstrate the state house ratings for Pennsylvania. And you can see a few things. Again, you can see that immediate support for Democrats within the confines of Pittsburgh, as well as within the Erie County, and some scattered Democratic support just across, even as central Pennsylvania is still strongly Republican. And you can even see this district in southwest Pennsylvania that is just a vestige of ancestral Democratic support. As well, in the Scranton and Wilkes-Barre area, you can see some Democratic support remain there. But there are a few interesting districts around here. You can see the outline of Chester County right over here, and really notice that there are no more safe districts in Chester County, or that even extend into Chester County. It really has gone through a major demographic change, as well as just a political change in general, that has caused it to go from a reliably Republican county to a safely Democratic county. And then you can see there's a district in Delaware County that is favored to actually flip to Democrats out of Republican hands. The incumbent Republican is not running again, and so this is a prime opportunity for Democrats to gain here. And then in Montgomery County, near Abington Township, there's another district that is ripe for a flip from Republicans to Democrats. And so this is really just another sign of the reconsolidation and the repositioning of political parties within the Philadelphia metropolitan area. There are still some scattered areas of Republican support, but nothing substantial at all. And so as a whole, if I can show you, the House is at least slightly favored to stay in Republican hands. However, barring, or rather, if there's any sort of major effort for Democrats and they're able to pick up many seats, and this could be a potential flip for the state legislature. The Senate is a different story because the state Senate is going to remain Republican. It's a safely Republican type of thing. It's going to remain in their hands quite easily. However, there are still some areas that are looking to flip. Erie County has its own district in this simulation of the Senate. And you can see here that it's a toss-up. It's currently controlled by Republicans. But if Donald Trump is not able to mirror performance in Erie County and in the city of Erie in general this November, then this is going to be a tough place for Republicans to hold. You can also see Harrisburg with Dauphin County. There's a district here that will potentially flip if conditions are right for Democrats. And then finally, you have another Delaware County district that is looking to flip, and actually Democrats are slightly favored to flip this district, which includes parts of Chester and just other parts of Delaware and Chester counties. The final thing I want to show you is an article that I think really speaks to the level of Democratic support that we've seen in the past few years rise in these types of counties. And so this is an article by the Philadelphia Inquirer about the 2019 election results. In 2019, there were some local races, especially within the Philadelphia area, that saw Democrats really make strong gains, especially in Delaware County. Delaware County, just to reemphasize its importance, it's really the base of the tide of Democratic support that's sweeping over the entire Collier area, which includes Bucks County, Chester County, Montgomery County, and Delaware County in general. But you can see from this article that it was the first time since at least the Civil War that Democrats won control of the Delaware County Council. They didn't just win a majority, but they also swept Republicans completely off the body, which is absolutely remarkable. There are also some gains in Chester County and Bucks County, which is not a good look for Brian Fitzpatrick. However, his own credentials will really speak for themselves because he is favored, after all, to win his race. And so this really shows you that Pennsylvania as a whole is home to many competing trends. And so not just Philadelphia, but also urban Pittsburgh and some of its immediate suburbs are seeing shifts to Democrats. However, Trump was able to win because the rest of the rural areas of Pennsylvania, were able to trend strongly towards him. And if he's able to continue that, then Pennsylvania might be good for him. It might be favorable more so than other states. But if Biden is able to capitalize upon his home field advantage, especially in the Scranton area, as well as further eat into Republican margins in some of the Philadelphia Collier counties, then he is going to have a very strong opportunity to not only flip the state as a whole, but to also influence those essential down-ballot races that would be quintessential for greater Democratic hegemony on all echelons of government in Pennsylvania.
Very good overview by Jared there. There's a few other things I want to mention here before we wrap up. If you haven't already, on the Elections Daily website where we all write and contribute, we have a writer, Joe Szymanski, who is from Pennsylvania and has written extensively on Pennsylvania. Specifically, those state Senate, the state legislative races, if Democrats want to have any chance of taking back the legislature, those central Pennsylvania districts around Harrisburg are really going to be key for them to do that. And at the moment, they've not shown the strength of that region to do so. But for a while, Democrats have really thought about taking over Lancaster County and some other areas around there. One other thing to mention with Pennsylvania is that on top of all the regular elections that we've been talking about, they also have a lot of statewide races up this cycle. They have 3 popularly elected statewide offices. So on Elections Daily, as I mentioned before, Joe Szymanski contributes, and he wrote up an article about the races. Democrats are currently favored to hold the Attorney General and Treasurer positions, both of those by pretty firm margins. But the Auditor General race is going to be an interesting one. The Democratic nominee, Nina Ahmad, is a progressive from the Philadelphia area. Surprisingly, she was able to defeat a moderate Democrat from the western portion of the state around Philadelphia, around the Pittsburgh area, by a pretty substantial margin in the primary, largely off the strength in the Philadelphia metropolitan area. But Republicans actually have a very credible nominee here, Tim DeFore. He's a Dauphin County controller, is African American, and the only candidate in the race there who has experience in a job similar to the office of Auditor General, which is an important office there. So out of those 3 races, the Auditor General is the one that Republicans have the best shot at overtaking. And if they do so, it's going to, again, rely on that crucial central Pennsylvania area of the state. In the past, there's been an idiom that as a state, Pennsylvania is like you have 2 big cities and then you have Kentucky in the middle. While it's kind of true, it's kind of informative of how some of it votes, there's a lot more competitiveness under the surface in Pennsylvania, specifically in those areas like Scranton and Harrisburg. So with that, I think we'll wrap up this week's edition of the Map Room. I thank you for watching. Where can you find you guys on social media, Jared and Nick?
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is at jsnopolitics.
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is Tossup Report.
You can find me on Twitter at DE Cunningham too. And you can find all of our articles at Elections Daily. That's at elections_daily on Twitter and elections-daily.com. You can also find us on YouTube. We have 4 weekly shows at this point, as well as some other programs we do. We also are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all sorts of other podcast shows. So be sure to check it out. There's a lot of other contributors, including some of us that appear for some of those shows. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you on next week's edition of the Map Room.